Find ourselves at the 12th parak in Shoftim. I will admit that this is one of the quieter chapters in Shoftim. Believe me, it's the quietest before the storm, because it's going to get much, much more exciting as we move into Perek Yud Gimel onwards. Perek Yud Gimel is going to enter into the phase of Shimshon, and after Shimshon we're going to enter into Pesel Micha and Pedagesh Begiva. These are dramatic stories. So right now is the quiet. This chapter actually is very much like Perek Yud, where it's in between the Shoftim, but even in its quietness, there's a lot to be said. So let's appreciate this. It's a short parak. We're going to hear about, I called the in-betweeners because we hear about a few quieter Shoftim that we don't know so much about. But before we get there, we have an unfortunate episode that occurs. And unfortunate is the description of the end of Shoftim, because there's lots of misfortune which occurs. But here's the episode. Ready? So the episode occurs as follows. It unfolds as follows. If you remember, our last time we had Yiftach had this incredible success, amazing victory, beats back the Ammonites, and you would think that everybody should be happy with victory, right? Meaning, if the nation of Israel are protected, then they should say, great, congratulations, and they should give all the kudos to the leaders. But that's not the way it works. So we have again, this is the second time in the book, we have the Ish Ephraim, the people from the tribe of Ephraim, who are not so happy with this victory. And they call out to Yiftach, and they say, in the first pasuk, Madua avarta lilachem bivnei Ammon, v'lanu lo karasa lo leches imach. Why did you not call us to be part of the battle? You went into this battle all by yourself, without even consulting us. And they say, therefore, Beischa nisroif olecha ba'esh. Right? They must have been Knicks fans. Right? They said, we'll burn down your house, right? So So they're very upset about not being included, and off they go to threaten him. Remarkable. It's remarkable that this is the reality. So Yiftach turns to them, and instead of turning down the temperature, he turns to them and he says, "Wait a second. Ish riv hayisiani va'amiu b'nei Ammon." We were fighting against the Ammonites, me and my people, meaning referring to the people in Gilad. We were fighting against Gilad. And I called out for help, and no one answered. Nobody cared enough to answer the calling. That's the way that he describes it. So he says, and because you weren't coming, I fought them off. So keep quiet. I won this war. So at this point in time, there's a strange statement that they make. They say he gathers his army to fight against them, and he kills a number of the people of Ephraim. Why? Ki amru in pasuk dalet plitei Ephraim atem Gilad b'soich Ephraim b'soich Menashe. You are the refugees of Ephraim in Gilad. Because the Ephraimites are in Menashe. Just this confusing little piece over here. Just to remember is that Yiftach comes from East Menashe. So he's on the east bank of the Jordan. Ephraim is on the west bank of the Jordan, neighboring West Menashe. They're denigrating him and saying, you are really the refugees. You're not the real Menashe'ites. We are friends of the real Menashe'ites, the West Menashe people. You are like the refugees, right? So they keep denigrating him, and so he goes to war with his own people, and he goes and he kills a number of Ephraimites. But more than that, what happens is he actually now does the opposite. He captures their refugees. What does he do? He says he closes the crossings of the Jordan, which would allow any Ephraimites to escape back to West Bank Israel. And they set up guards, and he said to them, he called out to them and he said to anybody trying to cross the Jordan, he says, Shiboles, please say the word Shiboles. Vayomer Siboles. See, here you see that all the people of Ephraim must have been Litvaks, right? Because they couldn't pronounce the sh, they could only say the s. So he said, please say the password, which is Shiboles. They couldn't, so he said Siboles, and upon that, at that moment, he killed them. They grabbed him and killed him right there on the channels of the Jordan. That's the way they did it, to eradicate all the Ephraimites who were escaping from Gilad. And you think, okay, maybe this is a small drama, but the Tanakh tells us that he killed 42,000. Well, that's just an astronomical number, right? Meaning this is the most amount of Israelites we've heard killed in the book of Shoftim is killed at the hands of Israelites, right? Unfortunately, what they say is, if the Arabs wanted to kill us, all they should just do is leave us alone for a few years, right? And we do it ourselves, unfortunately. We unfortunately don't. We're not so good at looking after ourselves, unfortunately. So terrible tragedy ensues after this, and we hear that he judges for 6 years, and he is buried Ba'arei Gilad in the cities of Gilad. So just a few things to be aware of. First of all, is just before we go further into the other judges, a few things just to understand is that actually. We've heard this whole business beforehand. If you remember, we actually saw that in Perek Yud there was also a claim in. Let me just see where it is. Oh, here we are. I think I put it here somewhere. Where did I put it? Oh, I think I must have skipped it. But if you remember, when it came to Gideon also had the same issue. Gideon was also approached by the people of Menashe, and they were also concerned about their inclusion in the war. And what did he say? He said, "Oh, the prunings of Menashe are worse than the main cuts of Ephraim." And he diplomatically lowered himself, and he said, "You're better than us," and everything de-escalated, and they carried on with their life. Interestingly enough, Yiftach does not de-escalate. Yiftach over here escalates it and turns it into a civil war. Civil war is going to be something which is going to plague us again and again, because we're going to see more and more discord internally in the nation of Israel as we move towards the anarchy at the end of Sefer Shoftim. And we're already seeing, just a few Shoftim along, that the Shofet Gideon was able to tone down the issue diplomatically, and Yiftach is not able to. He goes into full-out war, which is important to be aware of. It's also worthwhile noting that the Yalkut Shimoni points out that this problem comes in the wake of his personal tragedy, which means what happens is that he just made this neder, he just whatever to his daughter. We're not sure he killed her or he put her into a cloister. We're not sure what the outcome was. But the Midrash says in the wake of that, that's when Ephraim complained against him. And there's always something to be aware of, is that when a leader has demonstrated moral fallibility, they weaken their standing as a leader, which is instepping now all these complainers, all these concerned parties as well. The moral caliber of the leader personally is going to also affect their standing as well in terms of their ability and their strength, at least publicly as well. Lahavdil, not in terms of doing something bad, but if you remember, Menachem Begin, right? He was in LA at a fundraiser when his wife passed away, and when Aliza passed away, and it was a terrible thing. He never wanted to leave her, but from that moment onwards, he couldn't lead. At that point in time, afterwards, he never forgave himself for being absent when his wife passed away in Israel, and that was it. His personal tragedy. He never was able to recover from that. But it's just the personal tragedy and we'll call the circling of the hyenas, so to speak, which happens over here. And this is what's happening in this parak. But I think there's something more to this as well, and it comes back to you. I keep asking yourself, why is it Ephraim who keeps having an issue, right? Meaning Ephraim keeps coming back again and again and again, and who they're criticizing? The two people they criticize are Gideon and Yiftach. Both Gideon and Yiftach have these astronomically successful victories, and Ephraim isn't at the front. So you say to yourself, why is this? Well, the answer is which tribe did both Yiftach and Gideon come from that Ephraim is so concerned? The answer is his brother Menashe, right? Which should therefore also put into motion a question, which is the switching of Ephraim and Menashe. In fact, this switch happens a few times in the Torah. So, for instance, we're in the book of Bamidbar. In English, that's called Numbers. Now, Bamidbar does not translate to numbers, right? Bamidbar means in the desert. But the reason why it's called Numbers in English is because actually there's another name for the book in Hebrew as well. It's called Chumash HaPekudim, or Chomesh HaPekudim, which means the book of countings. Why is the book of countings? Because in Bamidbar we count the nation of Israel. There's a census, and in Parshas Pinchas, there's a census again. Those censi are essentially 39 years away from each other, right? But they frame the beginning and the end of the desert experience, and they're expressed in counting the numbers. There are a number of differences between the beginning and the end, not just in terms of numbers. One of the fascinating differences is who comes first of the children of Yosef. At the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, which we just read, we have Livnei Yosef le'Ephraim b'nei Elishama ben Amihud. So we know that in the beginning in Parshas Bamidbar, the tribe that comes first is Ephraim. In Parshas Pinchas, when it counts the children of Yosef, it describes, it goes, b'nei Yosef le'mishpachosam Menashe ve'Ephraim. Menashe comes first, which means there's a switch as to who of the two children of Yosef comes first in the Torah between the beginning and the end of the desert experience. So you say, wait a second, I have heard about switching of Menashe and Ephraim beforehand, because it's not the first time. In fact, the first time this happens is by Yaakov Avinu. On Yaakov Avinu, as Yaakov Avinu is getting old, and he calls in, Yosef gets word of this, he brings in his grandchildren, he asks who they are, he says, these are my children, they were born in Egypt, and he stretches out his hands to bless them, but he switches his hands. Sikel es Yadav. And he places his right hand on Ephraim, who's the younger one, and his left hand on Menashe, who is the older one. What is curious about that switch, and by the way, it seems on a macro scale, the Chumash is doing the same thing, right? Meaning the Chumash is doing the same thing in Bamidbar to show that there's a switch from Ephraim to Menashe, the reverse switch now, when they go into the land of Israel, right? So meaning, if we can understand Yaakov's considerations, we can understand the Chumash's switch. And if we can understand the Chumash's switch, we might be able to understand part of the complexity of Ephraim in Sefer Shoftim, always complaining about Menashe's leadership, right? Make sense? Meaning it's all layered back to that point. So the way to figure this out, to disentangle this, is to look at the language of the pasuk. The pasuk says, Sikel es Yadav, he switches his hands. Why? Ki Menashe habechor, because Menashe was the older one. Now, if you are focusing on that aliyah, when you're listening to Parshas Vayechi, you will notice that that's the wrong language, that's the wrong reasoning, right? He should switch his hands. Why? Because Ephraim is better, got more leadership qualities, something. There's another key, meaning this is not the right reason. Ki Menashe Bechor is the wrong reason. That's why you should keep your right hand on the older boy, right? So the Mefarshim try to explain that ki means despite, right? In this case, rather than because. But it's very hard to understand. The Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi of Berlin, makes the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva, makes a very, very profound insight, which he records both in Parshas Vayechi and in his introduction to Sefer Bamidbar, because it's really the same question of switching the children. And he says a very profound point, which I think most of us don't even think about, which is that if you wanted to switch which child is getting the prominent bracha, there is a very easy way to do that, and that is you just ask them to switch positions, right? You say Yosef brings them to you, and Menashe is on your right side, and Ephraim's on your left side, and you really want to give more precedence to Ephraim. What should you do? Just say, if Menashe, would you mind just, you bring him over here, and now you stretch out your hands, right? You just switch their positions as to who's more prominent, which means that Yaakov Avinu actually did not switch their position. He only switched his hands. So the Netziv points out, and if you think about this in terms of our body, right, think about the difference between our feet and our arms, right? Our legs and our arms, our feet and our hands. All our creative activity, our writing, our articulation is all in the hands, right? Our feet don't do too much except for ambulate, right? And yes, there are very creative people who can do amazing things with their feet, but generally speaking, right, it helps us to get from place A to place B, right? And we don't think so much. In fact, the word for regel actually is directly connected to the Hebrew word hergel, which means habit. It's something I don't think about so much. And it makes so much sense because the ambulatory tools of the body are, so to speak, in the lower regions of the body, right? The lower we go, the more, so to speak, animalistic material that we are. The arms actually are directly connected to between the head and the heart, right? So all our creative expression is given through our hands, not through our feet per se. And so he makes the observation like this, is that Yaakov Avinu decided not to switch where their feet were. He decided to switch where his hands were, which means spiritually, who's the leader? Ephraim. Physically, who's the leader? Menashe. Right? Ephraim was the one who learned with his grandfather in the land of Goshen. He was the spiritual leader. Menashe was the person who was the assistant to the vizier in the throne room. He had lots of political aspirations and he was going to do well. At the beginning of the desert, when we were about to spend 40 years in the Dorodea with all the physical accoutrements sorted out, no problems, who was going to be the leader then? Ephraim. That's why Ephraim comes first. When you go to the land of Israel and it's more complex and you need geopolitical leaders, then you're going to have Menashe, which is why the Chumash switches Menashe to be first as they go into the land of Israel, Ephraim as they're going into the desert. It seems that although our bracha on a Friday night to our sons and grandsons is Yisimchane Elokim Ke'Ephraim v'Chi Menashe, which is what the bracha is. That's why it says Ki Menashe Bechor. He switched his hands, not his feet. Ki Menashe Bechor, meaning Menashe still remains the Bechor for the feet, where he's standing, but Ephraim is the Bechor for the hands. Right? That's what the key is. And that bracha expresses the fact that we have different children who have different roles. He's not belittling Menashe, he's actually giving Menashe and retaining his position in his standing. What seems to be is that we wish for our children, our grandchildren, our bracha, is that brothers and sisters can get along, right? It seems that is being challenged in Sefer Shoftim. It seems that Ephraim is forgetting that it was just the hands, not the feet here. It seems that Ephraim feels left out enough that the question is being called back. It's the Yosef calling back and saying, wait a second, this one comes first. And Ephraim is saying, but I was chosen first, right? And there's that sort of the residual disappointment is over there. And in fact, the way he even calls the Eastern Menashe as refugees, he is really calling into question and saying, what right do you have to appoint a leader? We're the main part of Israel, right? You're just the outer perimeter. You don't have the right to nominate a leader. We're the nominations committee. We have a search committee. We have a process. There's bureaucracy. This is not just how it works. And his response is, we're being killed, right? And this speaks to the complexity of moving from states into federation and the difficulty of that, which is going to be our movement from Sefer Shoftim to Sefer Shmuel and Melachim, which is going to be where the federation takes over as opposed to the national identity as opposed to the statehoods, each individual tribes. And this underlines this complex thing, but I argue it goes all the way back to our initial sibling rivalry. So you may have thought that the Chumash may have ended ultimately in a quiet way regarding Menashe and Ephraim, but unfortunately the reverberations of that come back over here as well. A few things just to notice before we go further is that the word shiboles, like why do they choose that specific word? So actually the Yalkut Shimoni makes observation in source 9 that it's actually related to the word Sa-Baal. Sa-Baal is Baal is one of the Canaanite gods, right? To lift up the Baal, right? So if a person was used to saying Siboles, it means to say that their subconscious is used to, so to speak, dealing with this pagan deity, similar to Gidon asking the people to drink water, right? What is your subconscious way of drinking water? Do you get onto your all fours like you're prostrating? Or no, right? Meaning to say that's what this test was. There was a religious piece to this as well. And if you remember, just the last point over here is that we are told that he's buried in the cities of Gilad. In the cities of Gilad, right? Now, generally speaking, a person is buried in one place, right? It's very hard to bury a person in multiple places. So the Medrash, the Yalkut Shimoni, picks up on this and says, because Yiftach was not careful enough about trying to find Pesach for his daughter's the neder regarding his daughter, he died in a terrible way where his limbs fell off, dried off and fell off, and he had to be buried partially, piece by piece, in multiple locations. That's what the Medrash says is a punishment for not taking care of his personal affairs. Terrible, right? But I think that if you take a step backwards, there's something even more profound being said over here, is that the type of leaders were ultimately buried in different places. They weren't able to unite Israel. There was, in a certain sense, like they themselves fell to pieces, so to speak. Metaphorically, Israel is falling to pieces, right? There's no union over here. That image of the leader falling apart, so to speak, is the image of the people falling apart as well. That spiritual, decline, which is reflected over here as well. I also wonder if the fact that his daughter's buried one place and he's buried elsewhere, in a certain sense, part of him is buried with her, and he brought about her demise, and therefore he's buried in multiple locations as well. It's a very, very sad ending. We now go on to the next part of the parak, and we meet three very unknown Shoftim, because most people just don't know these names. There's very little attached to them. We first have a person by the name of Ivtzan. Ivtzan is from Beis Lechem. That's from Bethlehem. And we hear that he has 30 sons and 30 daughters who he married. And he judges Israel for 7 years and passes away and is buried in Bethlehem, in Beis Lechem. We then meet Elon Hazvuloni, who judged Israel for 10 years. He dies and is buried in Ayalon, in the land of Zebulun, not Ayalon in the central Israel, in Judea, but Ayalon in the north. And finally, we hear about a person by the name of Avdon ben Hillel from Piraton. He was called Piratoni. And he had 40 sons and 30 grandchildren, and he talks about how they would ride on these donkeys, similar to what an earlier Shofet we've heard about. And he passes away and is buried in Piraton after 8 years of leadership. So you say these, maybe we'll call these the minor prophets, because the minor judges, because you don't hear so much about them. But generally speaking, a rule in Tanakh is, if you don't hear so much about it, it's probably a good time. Meaning, like it can be very depressing learning Nach sometimes. You're like, is everybody evil? Is the human frailty expressed everywhere? And the truth is that when it's quiet, it's actually better. So for instance, in Parshas Chukas, there are 38 years which disappear in one pasuk. Because after the Korach episode, and we hear about Paraduma, then we get to the death of Miriam. The death of Miriam happens at the end of the desert. But up till now, we've been at the beginning of the desert in the first 2 years, which means 38 years go away. And why they're not talked about, the answer is because it was good. It was good. 38 years were good. We only hear about the complaints at the beginning and the end because we have lessons to learn from them. So sometimes we diminish the quietness. Let's embrace the quietness. This means society was operational, enemies were at bay, spirituality seems to be at equilibrium. This is good. So sometimes we spend so much time saying, oh, we know so much about Yiftach, but let's appreciate Ivtzan, yeah.
Why would so little information is there such a focus on the number of children?
Yeah, so I think, like the Abarbanel says, why do we need to know about the children? And why do we know what they wrote? And so his description, I think the way he describes it is that this is a symbol of success. Meaning, if you're having so many children, and all those children are noblemen, and all of them are successful, it's a sign that society is in a quiet place, right? There's no pretenders to the throne of your leadership. Nobody's killing your children. There's enough to go around for them to grow up. That's what so it's a demonstration, sort of the way of describing, so to speak, success in those days. Especially with there's just so many other reasons why it could not happen. I just put a map on, you could just sort of see. Elon comes from the area in the north where Zvulun is, just by the Galilee. And then we have Avdon. Avdon should actually go a little further up towards Shechem, the Avdon, and then we have Ivtzan, which is in Bethlehem, which is the south of Yerushalayim. If Bethlehem is in Yehuda, as is assumed, then this is going to be the second Shofet from Yehuda, because we had Osniel ben Kenaz as well was also so. But Be'er-Zemei. Let's go a little further for just a few moments. First, one little interesting snippet is that we always think of Hillel as a term from the Gemara, right? But Hillel came long before the Gemara. Hillel comes from our parak in Sefer Shoftim. And there was, in fact, I came across a question, the Shalas Yalavetz, as to how to spell the name Hillel in a get. There's very precise spellings of names. So in a get, it has to be very, very precise. How do you spell things? Because why? Because you can spell Hillel with a Yud and without a Yud. There's lots of names which have questions, as an example, like the name Aaron. Is there a Vav in Aaron? Right, as an example, the Torah, it has it without the Vav. But people spell names differently. These are called Malay v'chaser, where there's a letter there or not there, which doesn't actually change the pronunciation or meaning of that word. Somebody just sent me a clip of a comedian who said we should have silent letter day, right? For all the silent letters in the English language, which are not there. We're not going to go through that routine right now, but this is one of these silent letters, Malay. So the Iyov actually says, we see from the person who asked him said, maybe our Avdon ben Hillel was the exception, and maybe you should always spell it with the Yud. He said, no. If it's spelled without the Yud here, that means that's the way to spell Hillel. So the way you should spell Hillel is, hey, Lamed Lamed, we learned from our parak. Okay, better way, just an interesting halachic thing. Another question over here is, where is Piraton? Right, you haven't visited Piraton today, right? It's not on the map. So in the BDB, which is the Brown, Driver, and Briggs Hebrew and English lexicon, they put it as a city which is called today. Where do they say it? It's west of Nablus, of Shechem, in a place called Wadi Farah. Right, so or Farata. So if I just put it on the map over here, if you just drive a number of 7 miles to the west of Nablus or Shechem, there's a place called Farata, which is now part of the municipality of Imatan, which is an Arab city. Which is this is where Avdon was. Where what was our last shofet was? Avdon was living. So very very little details over here. There is one little piece over here which I'd like to observe, and that's how we'll close today, and that is Ivtzan. We do have a little more details about Ivtzan which are really important, and that is the Gemara in Baba Basra tells us over here that we know about Ivtzan in a different way in source 16. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rabba Bar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Ivtzan ze Boaz. Ivtzan, in fact, is in fact the character we know so well called Boaz. Interesting, right? And then the Gemara goes on to say that he made 120 feasts for his children. Why? Because he had 30 boys and 30 daughters he married out, and he described that he made 2 mishtaot. He made two feasts, right? So he obviously covered the Sheva Brachos and the Afraf, right? For these meals, and we made all these incredible meals. And then the Gemara goes on to say, "Uvechulan lo zimein es Manoach," and he never invited to his wedding Manoach. Why? It says, "Kudna akara b'mai par'a le." He says, "This sterile mule, how will he pay me back?" What he's saying is Manoach, who we're going to meet next week, is going to be ultimately the father of Shimshon. But for many years, Manoach and Mrs. Manoach are not going to have children. So as he is reaching the marriageable age of his children, he doesn't invite Manoach. And the technical language of the Gemara is he says, how is he going to pay me back? Right? The way that the Rashbam on the commentary on the Gemara says he says, look, he's not going to invite me to his children's marriages, so I'm not going to do this. The Ben Yehoyada, the Ben Ish Chai, his commentary on the Gemara is a little more charitable, and he says it wasn't that he was thinking in a quid pro quo way. He just said to himself in a more sensitive way, I'm not going to invite him to the wedding of my children because it's going to make him feel bad that he's going to all these chasnas, all these weddings, and he doesn't have children to marry off, right? But nonetheless, Manoach didn't know that. Manoach just knew that his neighbors were getting invited and he wasn't getting invited. So he felt really badly about this. The Gemara concludes, sadly enough, Tana v'kulon meisu b'chayav. All his children died in his life. So it's a really, really sad story that ultimately Ivtzan, this Boaz, lost his children, and part of it was the lack of sensitivity, the Gemara says, in dealing with the Manoach of the world. Now, this over here should now take us back to the Megillah for a second. If you remember Megillah Shuros, how does it describe? It says, Vayhi b'mei shvot ha-shoftim. It's in the days of the judges being judged. This, by the way, we equate Megillas because they're all on the same, they're on festivals, right? So we think of Megillas Esther, and Megillas Rus, and Megillas Eicha, Megillas Koheles, right? We think about these Megillas, Megillas Koheles, and we think of them, so to speak, written at the same time. They weren't at all. Megillas Rus is the earliest of all the Megillas by far. Megillas Rus takes place in the book of Shoftim. Perhaps when we finish Shoftim, we'll go into Megillas Rus because that's the stage that it's occurring in, as opposed to all other Megillas which happen much, much later on. Right? Megillas Esther is centuries and centuries later. Right? The Megillas Rus occurs in the Yemei Shvot HaShoftim. The Gemara is identifying is where can we place this Megillah? We know that Boaz is a very prominent member of society and is from Beis Lechem. Right? So the dots line up to make the assumption that who is in fact Boaz. Boaz is Ivtzan. And there's a certain tragedy in that if you think about it, because who does Boaz end up marrying? He marries another person who's coming from a very tragic life, right? A woman who gets married, and then she loses her husband, and then she becomes an immigrant to a new country, and she doesn't know anybody, and he, so to speak, takes her under He's wing. If you think about, so to speak, the birth of this child, that they have together is a birth of a child born out of tragedy on both sides, right? He has lived tragedy and she's lived tragedy, and nonetheless they come together to create destiny, which is fascinating because it reminds me of the Gemara in Baba Basra earlier on, which was talking about the individual by the name of Iyov, Job. And the Gemara is trying to pinpoint, when does Iyov live? Meaning, if Iyov was in fact a person who lived at a particular time, is there an Iyov we can point to? The Gemara has many suggestions as to when Iyov lived. And ultimately the Gemara says that Iyov, in fact, wasn't a particular person. Iyov is a character set of people who live. But in the suggestions of when he lived, one of the suggestions was that he lived at the times of Shoftim. He lived at the time of the era of Shoftim, which was our book as well. And that's what Rabbi Elazar says. Because everybody blamed Iyov for his tragedy. And he turns to them and says, why are you speaking meaninglessness? And the Gemara says, what generation is generation, which is the generation of meaninglessness, or where the Shofet was Nishbat? This is the book of Shoftim, which means Iyov lives here. I was tempted initially to think that maybe there's a parallel between Iyov and Ivtzan, this Boaz character, because he lost all his children in this terrible loss, and we know that Iyov also does. But if you look at the beginning of Iyov, that's not the case, because Iyov, it describes, has 7 children. It's not the same number of children, so it can't be the same person. But then I was reminded of an incredible observation made by Rabbi Yaakov Meidan, and he makes the following observation, is that maybe we're focusing on the wrong character. And I wonder if in fact there is in fact another Iyov in our story which actually parallels, and that is Naomi. Because we actually, we don't ever think about this from her perspective. Here she is. She has wealth. She has success. There's a little bit of a drought. They relocate. And in that time, she loses her husband, she loses her 2 children, and she loses all of her wealth, right? This is like sort of all the things that happened with Iyov, so to speak, are happening to Naomi, in fact, as well. In fact, the Malbim describes that when he died, it says, Ish Naomi, Elimelech dies, it describes her husband because nobody else knew who he was at that time. By the time he died, he was insignificant to society, even though he was everything beforehand. In fact, the words that Iyov uses are the same words that Naomi uses as well. So when Iyov loses first his wealth, his family, and then his health, he describes, I put it in source 21, Chai kel heisir mishpatai, Hashem removed my judgment, v'shakai heimar nafshi, God was bad to me. God did evil to me. When Naomi returns to Beis Lechem, and she comes back, she says, Ani mele'ah halachti, I went full, v'reikama shivani Hashem, but I came back empty. Lama tikrena li Naomi, don't call me Naomi, which has the connotations of beauty. She says, of Hashem Anabi, the Shakai Herali, God was bad to me. The same words almost identically as Iyov, in reflecting upon her same situation. In fact, there's a lot of confusion. If you remember when the friends of Iyov come to see him after his terrible tragedies, they come over to him, and in Pasuk Yud Beis in source 24, they say, they simply did not recognize Iyov. They couldn't recognize this person who'd suffered so much as the friend they knew just a year ago. And they wept upon seeing him, how much change had undergone in his life. Similarly, when she comes back, what happens? She comes to Beis Lechem, Naomi. Is this Naomi? We remember who Naomi was, a regal, powerful woman. She comes back as a broken beggar. Who is she? Right? The same confusion. Later on, they both are reinstated. And we know that in Iyov, Iyov is able to remarry and have children, and he has 4 generations afterwards. He's able to rebuild afterwards. Later on, in fact, we hear about 4 generations from Naomi as well, all the way down to David. We know that he is blessed again with 7 children at the end and 3 daughters. And when it comes to the birth of the child to Rus, They say this. The neighbors give her a blessing, and they say, "Ki chalosecha asher Ivtzan yalad tziv asher hitova lach mishiva banim." Better than 7 children. Meaning to say, like, all the parallels are of the book of Iyov. In a certain sense, Naomi being this parallel Iyov-esque, and I wonder if the Gemara is saying, maybe in the day of Shoftim, we do have a person called Naomi who's experiencing all of this. But here's the difference. The difference is very significant. And that is, Iyov is a book of a person trying to figure it out. Iyov didn't do anything to deserve what he got. That's very clear. We know as the reader that he was a good man, and he did good things, and he looked after his children, and he didn't do anything to warrant the terrible suffering that happened. In fact, we hear the conversation of the Satan with God, who says, I'm going to test him. But Iyov doesn't know this. And his friends come to him, and his friends say, it must be you did something. It must be you did this. Because God doesn't do this for naught. That's what ends up happening. And Iyov refutes them, and he says, I didn't do anything. And the entire conversation of Iyov is the philosophical question of, why is this happening to me? What is going on in my life? And finally, he turns to God, and he said, why did you do this? Finally, after all these tests, after 40 prakim of struggle, Iyov turns to God and says, it just doesn't make sense. I just don't deserve this. At which point in time, God turns to him and says, you don't know how this world works. Don't question me because I run this world. You don't even know. You don't know how the hinds give birth on the tops of mountains. Meaning, God goes this poetic description of how I run this universe. What is interesting is that in the book of the Ruth, where Naomi also suffers terribly, there are no philosophical questions. The book of Ruth is not a book of philosophy, of theology. It's not a book of theodicy. It is a book actually of what? What's it mostly filled with? Good action, doing, of actions. If you all the way through the book is about actions. Naomi is thinking about her daughters-in-law. She doesn't want them to come with her. They want to come with her. They want to continue the legacy of their lost husbands. When Boaz sees Ruth, he gives her special privileges in his field, looking after her. When Naomi says, go to Boaz in the granary, what she's trying to say, she says, I don't want you to be left alone. I want you to be taken care of. I want to marry you to somebody who's going to look after you. And Boaz turns to her and says, I know you could have found a young suitor, but you looked after me to maintain the memory of your husband. Ploni Almoni is the antithesis of this. He doesn't want to do. He's concerned about his legacy rather than his actions. The whole book is about action. In fact, even when Boaz turns to her at the beginning, he says, God should spread his wings over you. That's what he says. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should spread his wings over you. When she comes back to the granary, you know what she says? You should spread your wings over me. Meaning, don't talk about God. Talk about me. There's no conversations with God in the book of Ruth. There are only conversations with other people and action. And it in a certain sense, it takes me back to the incredible essay written by Rav Soloveitchik called Kol Dodi Dofek. It wasn't an essay, it was a speech he gave in the Lamp Auditorium in 1956. And it talks about the Holocaust, and it talks about the state of Israel. Very, very important essay. If you haven't read it, you have to. It explains our world today. In the beginning, he starts off with the notion of theodicy, and he talks about what he calls the man of fate and the man of destiny. He bifurcates the human existence, and here's what he says. I'd like to just read 2 snippets of the man of fate versus the man of destiny. He describes the man of fate first, the person who lives within the realms of fate. And he says it's very powerful. He says, after the psychic quaking of the sufferer, which comes first as a reaction to suffering, comes the intellectual curiosity of the sufferer, which seeks to understand existence and to strengthen the sufferer's safety and security. At this stage, man begins to examine suffering and ask weighty questions. He searches for the rational foundations of suffering and evil, and he endeavors to find the tranquility and harmony that lie between the positive and negative, and thus to remove the edge of tension between the thesis good and the antithesis evil of existence. Skipping down towards the last 3 lines of this paragraph, it is impossible to conquer monstrous evil with philosophical speculative thought. Thus, Judaism determined that man, submerged in the depths of a frozen fate, will in vain seek the solution to the problem of evil in the context of speculative thought, for he will never find it. Meaning, if you try to master evil with your mind, you will not get there. You're living within the realm of the man of fate, trying to understand God's fate. Why does he do this? And you'll never get the answer. That's what the Rav Soloveitchik says. Then he talks about the man of destiny. This is the man of action. And he says towards the the end of the paragraph, the beginning of the line, my print over here is, however, in the realm of destiny, man recognizes reality as it is and does not desire to use harmonizing formulas in order to hide and disregard evil. The child of destiny is very realistic and does not flinch in anticipation of a face-to-face confrontation with evil. His approaches are halachic and moral, and thus devoid of metaphysical speculative nuance. When the child of destiny suffers, he says in his heart, there is evil, I do not deny it, and I will not conceal with fruitless casuistry. I am, however, interested in it from a halachic point of view. And as a person who wants to know what action to take, I ask a single question. What should the sufferer do to live with his suffering? In this dimension, the emphasis is removed from causal and teleological considerations and is directed to the realm of action. The problem is now formulated in the language of a simple halacha and revolves around a quotidian, daily task. The question of questions is, what does suffering obligate man to do? And this is the differentiator he talks about between the man of fate and the man of destiny. In terms of awakening, he's going to obviously scale this outwards as he relates to the Holocaust and the shadow of the Holocaust of what is doing. I believe, and sort of Meidan makes observation, is Naomi and Iyov, in a certain sense, go through the same things but come out in a different way. Iyov spends the time trying, like the man of fate, to figure it out, and ultimately he does not succeed, and the book doesn't even tell him. Meaning, when he asks of God, God does not say, by the way, this was because it was a test. He never says that. He just says, I ran the world, because you'll not figure it out with your mind. But when Naomi goes through the same things, she never has a conversation with God. Not at least recorded in the book. What does she do? It's all action. It's all about caring for the other. Ultimately, their redemption in the book of Ruth is the redemption of action, not philosophy, not thinking about things. Which I think now, coming back to this as a whole, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it comes back to this mysterious figure called Ivtzan. Ivtzan, in a certain sense, is also suffering. Ivtzan lost his children, and perhaps it was even because of his sensitivity, and perhaps it was the wrong sensitivity, but he went through a tremendous amount of suffering. And yet, this broken family and this broken family find each other, and as they find each other and support each other through their tragedies as they rebuild, that's the beginning of the birth of a king called David, right? And that happens sort of buried here amidst the tragedy and the complexity of the book of Shoftim and all the things we think should have been better and perhaps could have been and would have been and ought to have been. But in that, there's a personal drama which is unfolding over here, which bespeaks the unique resilience of the nation of Israel on a national level, but also on a personal level, as we see these two stories converging. I think it gives so much more hue to the book of Shoftim and to the book of Ruth, which is running parallel to this parak as well. We'll Ezra Hashem will pick up next week. Thank you so much, everybody.